Hey, it's Daniel from Theology is for Everyone with more insights in Matthew. In chapter 18, there are actually several things that we should point out to make sure that we have a proper interpretation of what Jesus is teaching here. And in the first section, we notice that the closer and closer that Jesus and the apostles get to Jerusalem, the more they become concerned about who's the greatest. We see this in chapter 18. We see this toward the end of chapter 19. Oh, what are we going to get when we get into the kingdom? In chapter 20, they actually start to argue over it, and some people start to make some power plays. And so we see this as a recurring theme as we get closer to Jerusalem and Passion Week. Jesus uses an illustration here at the beginning of chapter 18, and the illustration is a little child. What we need to notice is that Jesus repeatedly says, like a little child. He's not talking about children here. Some people use this, if somebody makes a child sin or leads a child into sin or hurts a child, they're doomed. Well, I don't think that's what Jesus was talking about. The child was the illustration. And so you'll see repeatedly, like a child, like a little one, like these little ones. And so he's referring to all believers, or he's referring to all followers from that standpoint, and using the child as an illustration. Another thing that we want to make sure that we point out is there's some pretty harsh language in these first few verses. Woe to stumbling blocks. He comes back to the same type of concept that he did in the Sermon on the Mount, for verse 8, for instance, or if your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off. Should we be following that today? No. Why? Isn't that it? I mean, Jesus said it, right? Red letters. Yeah, but look at what the rest of it says. It's better for you to enter life crippled or lame than to go with 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into eternal fire. Now, hold on. Is eternal fire something that a Christian, a believer in Jesus Christ in the church age, is that something that we are in danger of? No, not at all. Romans 8:1 says there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. We don't have to worry about going into hellfire or anything. So that's one of those things, like in the Sermon on the Mount, and you can go back to the video on chapter 5 and see some of these things as well. That's something that we don't have to worry about. So there is a teaching here. Should we be a stumbling block? No, of course not. We see that all over Paul's letters to the churches. But that doesn't mean we're in danger of hellfire if we don't chop off our hand or chop off our foot or pluck out our eye or something like that. Jesus briefly, or Matthew, I should say, briefly records Jesus' parable of the lost sheep. Luke 15 actually tells the whole parable, which is 3 acts or 3 parts of the parable: the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. And it's worth looking at the whole thing in its context. Matthew just refers to the sheep part of it. The rest of the chapter, starting with verse 15, has to do with sinning brothers, back and forth, sinning and between brothers, and forgiveness. Now, there's a lot of stuff in verses 15 through 20, and it's well worth, you can read some of this in my book, and you can contact me for more information, or if you'd like. But we need to look at verses 15 through 20 as a package. We cannot stop, like a lot of people try to do, with verses 15, 16, and 17 as a package, and then completely set that apart from verses 18, 19, and 20. People like to take verse 19, for instance. If 2 or 3 of you agree on anything, and whatever you do, the Father has to do it for you. To verse 20, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'm there with them, like it's a prayer meeting or something. It's not. First of all, you don't have to have 2 or 3 people gathered together to have a prayer meeting. You can pray by yourself, and just because 2 or 3 people say, "Thus, this is what we demand of God," He doesn't have to do it. That's not what this is about. In context, this is the second time that Jesus refers to this church that is to come. The apostles didn't know anything about it yet, but in Jesus' assembly, in Jesus' congregation, there are certain ways, certain steps that he wants his people to react and confront one another when it comes to sin. And he laid these steps out. And then he said, if you do these steps, whatever you bind or whatever you loose, and that refers to the judgment that the apostles and then the elders and the congregations have on sinning believers, whatever you bind and whatever you loose will have already been bound or loosed in heaven. Essentially, if you follow my steps, with my congregation and my church, the judgments that you make will agree with what I have already said, what the Father has already said in heaven. And if 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'm there with them, and it is my authority that they're doing this with. If 2 or 3 gather and bind someone or loose someone under the judgment of the church, then the Father will, basically recognize that. That's what the passage says. And so, again, you can contact me for more information on that if you'd like. Peter thought that was pretty cool, this whole concept of binding and loosing. He's like, well, how many times do I have to forgive before I can start binding people? Like 7? And Jesus said, hold on a second. You think you're being generous. The rabbis only required 3, and you're saying 7. How about this? Depending on your translation, how about 77 times or even 70 times 7? And that didn't make Peter all that particularly happy because he thought he was being generous. Of course, the point is we're not keeping count. We're not keeping count. Christianity is based on grace and forgiveness. In fact, it's the only world religion that is based solely in grace. It is by grace that we are saved, it's by grace that we are kept, and it's by grace that we minister and that we live out this life with other people. It's all about grace, and we should not forget that. Then Jesus told a parable of a slave who was given great forgiveness and then did not show that forgiveness to someone else. He owed millions or maybe even tens of millions of dollars to his master, basically something he could never pay in his lifetime. Legitimately, he could never pay it in his lifetime. And his master just forgave it. Such this great debt, sort of like our debt of sin. Then he found a fellow slave who owed him basically about 3 months' worth salary, and he threw him into prison until he could pay it all, showing no grace, no forgiveness, no anything at all. And the master pardoned the other guy and threw the wicked slave into prison, basically sentencing him for the rest of his life. And Jesus' point is that we are to extend grace and forgiveness as well. I hope that makes a lot of sense to you. We'll pick up here in chapter 19.